Thank you very much. Delight to be here. And a particular delight to be on stage with my friend and colleague, Anne Applebaum, who, as you've just heard, has written a book published 2024 called Autocracy Inc., which is admirably short and concise, 180 or so pages. Most of us have barely cleared their throats by page 181, and you finished your book.
Ed has written a very long book, by contrast, but I can recommend his book too.
It's unputdownable, actually. But the really most salient fact about Autocracy Inc. was that it only came out in 2024, but the world has more than vindicated the thesis of your book since then. Of course, you wrote it just before Trump was re-elected. And we're going to get into Trump. But first of all, I'd just like to ask you, give us a little précis, a little account about what you mean by Autocracy Inc. And the key word there is Inc.
Incorporated, yes.
Yeah.
So first of all, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. We had a session earlier, it was a large panel. I didn't want to take up time saying how much I enjoy being here and how terrific I think this audience is. It's my second visit here, and I do hope to come back. Autocracy Inc. is a book that makes an argument about modern dictatorship. And the argument is that we have in our heads a very old-fashioned idea about dictators, that there's, a bad man at the top and then some, secret policemen who help him, and then maybe there's some dissidents and they repress everybody, and that's what it looks like. Actually, in the modern world, autocracies are connected to one another, and they're connected through financial interests, through political interests, through common narratives, and they learn from one another as well. And the title of the book actually comes from, I was looking for a metaphor to describe the way they relate to one another, because they don't share an ideology. So we're not talking about the old Soviet bloc where everybody had the same language, they used the same ideas, they even had the names of their airlines were the same, and so on. This is very different. And instead what we have are countries that operate a little bit like a business conglomerate, like a corporation. So there are lots of different companies, each one has its own business model, and they work together opportunistically when it suits them and when it's useful. There are some things that unite the group, and one of the things that unites the group is a common dislike of the language of liberal democracy. So the language of rights, the language of freedom, the language of transparency, accountability, the language, and above all, the language of rule of law. So this is a group of countries whose what they have in common is that they are run by a single person or sometimes by a political party that seeks to rule without checks and balances, without opposition, without real free press or free media, without free speech, and without any transparency about what they do and above all how they make their money. And anyone who talks about the rule of law or transparency, accountability, democracy is a problem for them. And so they share that sensibility, and then they work together. And it's very pragmatic. I mean, so the quasi-state, quasi-private companies of one dictatorship will work with the quasi-state, quasi-private company of another. The Chinese will sell them all surveillance technology. They will learn from one another methods of suppressing dissent. We've seen them cooperate very specifically in a few places. So in the war on Ukraine, you have had, think about how amazing this is. There have been North Korean soldiers in Russia fighting Ukrainians. There have been Iranian drones in large numbers purchased from Iran and used by the Russians. Trade with China has also been not just the purchase of oil, but beyond that, the Chinese have contributed components and spare parts and electronics that the Russians need for their defense industry. So you can see them working together to help Russia, really actually to help Russia stay on the battlefield, because the Russians are not winning the war, but they're they're kind of holding the front line, just about, and they're doing so thanks to this network of other countries who see it is in their interest to support Russia. So that's what the thesis of the book was. That obviously the book was written in 2024. It was published, I think, in July, so in the summer, well before the end of the U.S. election. And there are elements of it that have changed since then, which maybe we can talk about. But the bigger idea that there is that these are countries who don't share an ideology, that we're talking about communist China, nationalist Russia, theocratic Iran. Even though they don't share an ideology, they find ways to cooperate and work together. I think that basic thesis is still very true.
So I was trying to think of the difference between, say, the Soviet Union in the Cold War and Russia today. And we're going to get on to America in a moment. And I guess one of the differences is that Brezhnev, Khrushchev, Stalin, none of these people were personally getting very rich. Putin's worth, what, $50 billion estimated?
Oh, much more.
So why, you could have called your book Kleptocracy Inc., right?
Yes, actually, I've written an article in the last year called Kleptocracy Inc., and I actually have a Substack on which I publish almost weekly or every 2 weeks a kleptocracy tracker that keeps track of kleptocratic ideas. But that doesn't quite encompass all of them, and it doesn't explain the full range of what they do, because these are also states that are interested in repression and that fight wars and they do have some other goals other than just enrichment. But the kleptocracy model, which is of states where the rulers of the state, so the political leadership, are also the owners of the biggest companies, and therefore aren't just making economic policy or decisions, but are actual beneficiaries of government decisions. That's what kleptocracy is, and that fits some of them. It certainly fits Russia. So the people who own Gazprom or who own the big Russian companies are also the people who control the country. And therefore, political decisions about anything, about foreign policy or about inflation rates or about economic policy, are often made not for the benefit of Russians or for the people of Russia, but for the benefit of the people who run the country. And that is the definition of a kleptocracy, that political power is used to procure money or economic power.
So let's just sort of take it back a little bit to the end of the Cold War and Western triumphalism, and the idea that the openness of our systems would gradually spread to other systems. What we've had in practice is actually the openness of our systems boomeranging on us, because these people aren't getting rich without our cooperation. And you write very, very vividly about how real estate agents in London or Hampshire or Sussex or Kent, accountants in Delaware or Nevada and New York, financiers across the Western world are absolutely hand in glove with Autocracy Inc. In fact, Autocracy Inc. probably wouldn't work, certainly not on a global level, without the deep financial complicity of the West. And that's...
Yes, although I don't use the word West anymore, I would say without the democratic world. But so to be fair to the people of the 1990s and the 2000s, when they began the process of opening up the world, of creating, the world has always been, there's always been a global economy. This country knows it more than anybody. But when they began the process of the openings to Russia and the former Soviet Union and to China, the people who were doing that were people who had personally experienced the successful integration of Europe and the spread of prosperity as a result. So there was between the Second World War and 1989, there was this experience of integration and success that Europe was trying to repeat by bringing in Central Europe and Russia. And to be clear, in Central Europe, it succeeded. So we have the growing prosperity of the Central European former communist states, many of whom doesn't even make sense to talk about them as former communists anymore, because they're so their political systems have become so different. But it was also true at that moment that there were people in Russia who also believed that by opening up their economies, they would do deals with the West, they would grow in prosperity, but also that they would open up their societies, and that the result would be at least a more open, or if not a perfect democracy, more open system. And in addition to that, there were people in China who believed the same thing. So the Chinese also thought that the point of globalization wasn't just wealth, it was also that this open ideas would spread further and we would have a less repressive world. And so to be fair to everybody, it wasn't just some naive people, in Washington, D.C. who thought this. This was a very broad, widely held belief. And I do think it worked for some period of time. As I say, it worked for Central Europe. But there was a turning point. There was a moment when, as you had the consolidation of power and the consolidation of wealth, as the wealth in especially, well, I'll talk for the moment about just Russia and China. The book has a broader as you had the consolidation of wealth in those countries, you had leaders emerging who began to fear that their power and their wealth would be challenged by the language of liberal democracy. In other words, the people who talked about rights, about transparency, that language would hurt them and remove them from power. And this is Putin begins this. I think she is also a kind of reaction to this. If you think about the language of the Hong Kong democracy movement, or you think about the language of the Navalny movement in Russia, which was an anti-corruption movement, this was the kind of thing that the rulers of Russia and China and others around the world, Iran and others, were pushing back against. And so there was a moment when they, I think, turned against the idea of, globalization leading towards a more open world, and they began, changing their language and tactics. But another piece of that, you're right, is the fact that there were so many businesses and companies and indeed politicians who were also complicit in that process. As those countries began to close, as they began to be more repressive, there were plenty of U.S. companies, and especially the financial system that enabled the secret theft and laundering of money around the world, was a huge aid to autocracies. Autocracies need secrecy. They work best when nobody knows what they're doing. I mean, you asked me about Putin's money. Actually, we don't really know how much money Putin has, because we don't really understand which companies he owns, and which he has these palaces, and he seems to have friends who are strangely wealthy, who may be owning who their money may really be his, but we don't really know. And the same is true of Xi Jinping. We actually have no idea how wealthy he and his family are, and it's illegal to report on it.
So, I mean, there was the Panama Papers. We've had exposés about the Cayman Islands. If you're in India, it's Mauritius. But basically, I mean, you had, I think, Putin's judo teacher, or was it his viola teacher?
It was a cellist.
Cellist.
No, it was a
cello
cellist.
teacher.
His friend, the cellist,
is worth $2 billion.
That's right.
Which is really good pay for teaching the cello. I
Yep.
mean, so we get sort of reasonable ways of estimating what his actual wealth is. But so autocrats, illiberal leaders around the world are using these offshore Western systems, and onshore, in the case of Delaware and London and Nevada, in order to disguise their money and to do it anonymously. That's one thing. Another thing is Trump coming back and creating a kind of grift that, even by the fairly moneyed standards of American democracy, is off the charts. Talk to us a little bit about the Trump impact on Autocracy Inc.
So what you need to know, I don't know how much this is reported in India, but one of the unique features of the second Trump administration is that the open use of politics and political power for financial gain of the president and of his family and of his friends is very, very open. It is not hidden. I mean, and so this is in a way an innovation. And it's new for America. We, of course, in America, rich people have always been very important, and they've always been very influential, and maybe sometimes in the past too influential. But we have never had a sitting president directly earning money, into his own personal bank account while he is the president at this scale. And we had presidents who, I don't know, they helped their brother-in-law. Ulysses Grant supposedly helped his brother-in-law get some contracts, and there are some other examples like that, but there's nothing like this. This is completely new for the United States. And so we have, for example, there is a price you can pay in Washington that will, if you have a relative who's been indicted or imprisoned, there is a price that can help you get him pardoned by the president.
There's a menu,
exactly. There's if you want access to the president, there are ways you can pay for that. The president's family has created a crypto company called World Liberty Financial, and again, I'm repeating things that have been reported in the newspaper and are not disputed. So there's a company called World Liberty Financial, into which people can invest anonymously, and some people have invested very large amounts of money. The money investment goes into the company. You buy coins, there's Trump coins for your money.
Stablecoin,
and which you can then, I think it's changed a little bit since then, but initially you were not even able to, once you bought them, you couldn't sell them or trade them. In other words, people were paying money into this company as a gesture of whatever, respect, you use the word bribe, I don't know, for the president. And was it in exchange for something? We don't know, because people were doing it anonymously. You can invest anonymously, and this is as a kind of classic. Again, I repeat that autocracies love anonymity, and so this is there are ways to get money to the president, to his colleagues, to his family that were unimaginable in the past. And in this sense, I think this is actually the piece of Trumpism that most resembles the autocratic world that I wrote about. I mean, there are other aspects too, but and for Washington, it's happened so fast, and it's been such a big change that people haven't. The legal system is beginning to react, but hasn't really been able to do so yet.
I mean, and just to be clear, World Liberty Financial is owned by Eric and Donald Trump and Zach Witkoff.
Right. So so Trump's negotiator, Steve Witkoff, who is a former real estate investor, who is a colleague of Trump's in New York, his son is also a direct beneficiary of these investments. And for example, how does that work? How does it affect U.S. policy? Well, we know, and again, this has been printed in newspapers, it's not disputed by the Trump administration, that alongside the negotiations in Ukraine about borders and about security guarantees and so on, the U.S. and Russia have also been negotiating about future business deals. And, and those deals could presumably benefit maybe not Steve Witkoff himself, but perhaps his family, maybe not Trump himself, but perhaps his family, or else donors, or else people who are close to them. And so again, the involvement is direct. It's not indirect. It's the same people who are doing the negotiation with Putin and with Zelensky are also negotiating business deals on behalf of the U.S. or U.S. companies.
So this isn't just a conflict of interest. We need a new vocabulary. Trump has recently, in the last 48 hours, announced his reconstruction board for Gaza. The Board of Peace.
Board of Peace, yep.
Which I think George Orwell was exhumed and brought back from the dead to name. And this Board of Peace is composed of, amongst other people, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who has many business interests in the Middle East.
In the Middle East.
It includes basically sycophants and loyalists around Trump. It includes Tony Blair, but I repeat myself, and others like that. And now apparently, governments to join the board have to pay $1 billion.
No, so the letters of invitation were sent out in the last few days to other people to join this organization, this board. And attached to the letter was a kind of charter of the board. And it reads a little bit like a golf club charter. There's how you become a member, and you're a member for 3 years, and what are the rules, and so on. And one of the aspects of the club is that members will join for 3 years. If you want to be a permanent member, you contribute $1 billion to the chair. And it's unclear to whom it goes, the U.S. Treasury or to the president himself, I don't know. But the language of the documents makes it look like this is what they want to replace the UN, a kind of U.S.-chaired business-style board in which people who can pay a lot of money have more influence. That's what it looks like. I mean, we're still at early stages of trying to understand what it is.
And so to become a permanent member of the UN, originally, you had to be a nuclear weapons state. To become a permanent member of the Board of Peace, you give Trump $1 billion.
You give someone $1 billion.
It's just hard to make this shit up, right? I mean, it's unbelievable.
It's hard to make up.
Okay, so let's talk about Trump's foreign policy and kleptocracy. Now, one example is India-Pakistan. A lot of attention was paid to the fact that Modi wouldn't propose Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize and didn't pretend Trump had solved the India-Pakistan conflict, that brief conflict in April, whereas the Pakistanis did, and the head of the Pakistani military, Azim Munir, went out of his way to say Trump solved it. And that is one explanation for why Trump's so annoyed with Modi and has these punitive tariff rates on India. But another is that the Pakistanis are playing a crypto game that for all the depredations that have happened to Indian democracy, it would be much harder to pull off in India than in Pakistan. And just 3 days ago, I believe the Pakistanis signed a deal with an offshoot of World Liberty Financial, the Trump children, Zach Witkoff vehicle, to have some kind of a crypto deal. This is a world where we're looking at bilateral trade deals or foreign policy in general and thinking, what is the purpose here? What's the geopolitics? What's the global economics? When actually the purpose is hidden in plain view, right?
Yeah, so none of this stuff is secret. I mean, we were just before this session, we were reading about the Pakistani World Liberty Financial crypto deal in the Wall Street Journal, right? I mean, not a dissident newspaper, you know.
And the Financial Times.
And the Financial.
Yeah,
sorry. Very important to mention the Financial.
Much better reported.
Much better reporting in the Financial Times. But it's very open, and it's understood that one of the ways in which you can now influence foreign policy, or at least get the president's attention, is through doing one of these deals with his family, with his friends, and so on. And that is I'm sure if we looked back in the history of the United States, we would find other examples of rich people influencing policy in different ways. But I am unaware of anything this crude. That it's just simply possible to pay into a fund or do a deal, and then get some kind of, military or diplomatic or political reaction from the United States. So it's that in that sense, it's a new world. And you're right, there are states for whom this is not going to be possible. I mean, so most European democracies would not be able to pay a bribe to the Trump family. Like, you can't, I mean, if you wanted to, you wouldn't be able to do it. There would be backlash, there would be complaints, they don't have a mechanism to do it, they don't have those kinds of companies that would do it. And so it's very hard to know how you would, and this is why you see instead Europeans, they go to Washington, they have nice meetings with Trump. I mean, you did have actually there was a Swiss delegation that came to the White House that as a present, just a cute little souvenir of Switzerland, gave the president a gold bar, which I think was worth, I don't know, $170,000, something like that. And the president said, he was asked, the press secretary, is he keeping the bar? Of course he's keeping it. It was a present for him, right? So that's a small version of it. But most, and that wasn't from the Swiss government, it was from a company. But it's a way of doing business that democracies are very uncomfortable with. Anywhere where there's any openness or any accountability, you just can't do that.
I mean, so that's one way for a democracy to get round it. The Swiss sent, I think it's Rochemont, the company, and they gave the gold bar and the carriage clock, the expensive carriage clock, a couple $100,000 between them, and that buys a reduction in the Swiss tariff rate from 39% to 15%. So it's nothing to pay for that. It's a difference between recession and growth for Switzerland, a couple $100,000. But by American history, taking a $200,000 bribe breaks the emoluments cause of the American that is open corruption.
Right. Constitution very specifically says the president can't take, they're called emoluments, which is a fancy word for bribes. You can't take anything from a foreign country. So it's very clear in the Constitution. And again, the gold bar was presented in public, no secrets. It was done very openly.
So what do countries like, I mean, I guess if India is going to take the Swiss approach, Mukesh Ambani or Adani or one of them will come and give Trump another golf course in Gurgaon or something. And then there will be a reduction in the Indian tariff rate. Is that the lesson to draw from this? That you personally bribe?
So I'm not advocating that anybody bribe anybody, okay? No. Let's be clear. But also you have to be careful because even not all bribery works, and also, because Trump's mood changes and because his policy has some whimsical aspects to it, you have to also take into consideration the fact that he might wake up one morning and put tariffs on you anyway. I don't know that in the long term, it's a useful way to think about doing business.
So I've been thinking of the news in the last 3 days. Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, America's closest, most intermeshed ally, the best ally you could think of, the nicest neighbor you could possibly have, Canada. Because of Trump's designs on Canadian sovereignty, his direct threats, the Prime Minister of Canada has said, well, who else do you go to? And he's gone to China. And he's done deals with China. That's another method, right? And I'm sure you won't recommend it, but that is a natural consequence.
Well, actually, Canada's done a bit more. Canada has also now has a defense pact with the European Union. They're looking to solidify some of their relationships in Latin America. I mean, China has gotten the most news, the most attention. But I think it's actually symptomatic of something we're going to see everywhere, which is that people will begin to hedge. So everyone will look for new allies and new alliances. India and China are friendlier than they once were, and that will probably continue. India and Europe there's a kind of free trade deal that has been on the table for years and years. Maybe it's time to renew that. But you will begin to see all of America's former allies hedge, do deals, look for other contacts, look for other relationships. And that, it's really only been a year, right? And it's already happened. I mean, it's already begun. And so in my view, the U.S. policy is ultimately suicidal. I mean, it removes the United States from a web of collective alliances and collective security that have worked not just for America, but for many others for a long time, that created prosperity for those allies. And we go into a much more uncertain future where it's not clear whether global trade will be able to continue, whether shipping will remain something that you can rely on that's safe, and so on. And we're walking in a direction that could be quite dangerous.
I mean, so another development in the last 72 hours, and given the pace of events and the flooding the zone quality of the Trump administration, you could say this about any previous 72 hours. But the last 72 have been particularly notable in terms of Trump's posting about Greenland, which is, since you won't sell Greenland to me, Denmark, and since you're being supported by France and Germany and Britain in not selling Greenland to me, I'm going to impose 10% extra tariffs over and above what I've already imposed on you as a price, and that will then go up to 25% if you don't yield. Why does he want Greenland so much?
So now you've hit on one of my favorite subjects. I went to Denmark exactly a year ago, in January of last year, this was right at the beginning. Trump had mentioned Greenland, right after his election, and the Danes said to me, "Here's what's extraordinary about this story to us: everything that the United States could want to do in terms of security, it can do through its treaty relationships with Greenland." In the past, the U.S. had several bases in Greenland. During the Cold War, the U.S. kept nuclear weapons in Greenland, even though technically Greenland was a nuclear-free zone. So it was and Denmark was a nuclear-free zone. So Denmark has made Greenland accessible. It has made it part of the NATO defense system going back, since the 1940s. Economic investments. You want to invest in Greenland, which is, by the way, a very, very difficult place to do anything because it's very cold and there's a lot of ice. You are welcome.
It's not very green.
And it's not green at all.
It should be called Iceland.
It should be,
Iceland should be called Greenland.
It was a game the Vikings played because they didn't want people to go there, to Iceland. But it's there are companies looking for minerals and so on there right now. And when I was there a year ago, I don't know whether this has changed in the last year, there was, I think, only a tiny number of U.S. companies there. They were mostly European. So there is no economic explanation for it either. And even Trump, in the last few days, when he speaks about Greenland, doesn't talk about either economics or security in any detailed way. He just says, it is psychologically important to me that I have Greenland. In other words, we're talking about Trump himself having a temper tantrum. He wants it. He wants to make his stamp on the map. If you look at a Mercator projection of the world, then Greenland looks like it's very, very big, almost as big as Africa, where actually that's, of course, not the case. And he simply wants it because he wants it. And he is right now, the difference between Trump's first term and second term is that right now he's surrounded by people who are dedicating themselves to enable these whims and desires. And that's the real reason. And of course, that's almost impossible for people like you and me, or I'm sure people in this audience to accept. So we want there to be a theory, or there's a Trump doctrine, or there's an explanation for it. But my sense of Trump is that he doesn't think geopolitically at all. He doesn't think strategically at all. He doesn't think about what the impact of, pressure on Greenland will be, for example, on the Russians, who it will encourage them to continue invading Ukraine. He doesn't think about any of that. He just thinks, this is what I want, and I want it. And that's hard for America's allies to understand, and it's hard for anybody to understand. Also, one other point about Greenland. Imagine that the U.S. Marines landed in Greenland tomorrow. What would happen next? Okay, so if they were Russians, what they would do, what they've done in occupied Ukraine, they would round up everybody in the parliament and all the leading politicians and intellectuals, and they would round them into a concentration camp in Russia, and they would, shoot people who disagreed. Okay, I don't think the U.S. Marines are going to do that. So what will they do? They will arrive in Greenland and do what? It hasn't even. I don't feel that this policy has even been thought through to the next stage. Other than I want it. I want it, and then what? How would I occupy it? How would I control it? It makes no sense.
I assume, and this segues into the question I wanted to ask you before I ask for audience questions, is I assume that Trump thinks this latest escalation will panic Denmark into selling it. And he doesn't realize that the Danes are descendants of Vikings, and it just makes them dig their heels in even more. They're not going to sell it. And therefore he's not going to get the... But so the question I wanted to ask, and then I will hand it over to the audience for the last 10 minutes. The question I wanted to ask is, this is sort of cartoonish what's happening. I mean, we talk about, Trumpism, but Trumpism in his first term was one thing. What's happening now, I mean, again, just in the last 3 days, the Nobel Prize winner, the Venezuelan opposition winner, Machado, she goes to the White House, she gives him her Nobel Prize and says, I'd like it to be yours. And he says, yeah, thanks, I'll keep it. I mean, you couldn't make this up. I know 6-year-olds who are more mature than that and less possessive. So does the cartoonish ugliness and stupidity of this, is it actually our ally? Is it so gross that this is just going to implode?
I mean, it looks as gross to Americans as it does to you. I mean, so at least, you know, we have in America, as you have here, we have a very, you know, divided media space where people read very different news in different parts of it. And so those who know about the Nobel Prize story are horrified by it, and many people just don't know about it. So that's true. I mean, but there's childish, cartoonish. The Danes actually use the word Kafkaesque. I mean, there's a kind of absurdity. You know, it's explained to Trump over and over again why anything he wants to do in Greenland they can do already, and he keeps repeating the same things over and over again. So there's a feeling that people have of absurdity or unreality. And that also makes it hard to know how to act. I mean, should the Europeans send their armies to Greenland, or is that crazy too? You know, should we start talking about economic sanctions on the United States, or is that crazy too? I mean, there is a level of policy debate that is now it's out of the realm of reality. And everybody feels that. People feel it in Washington, they feel it in London, they feel it in Germany. I mean, everyone, and you know, the irony is, the closer you are to the United States, the closer was your relationship, your trading relationship, or your political relationship, the more badly affected you are by this administration.
So we've got a little under 10 minutes for questions. So there's a lady in the front row, and just please don't give your biography, just as a question. I didn't suspect you would, but just a general plea. Ask
you
a
can
straight
tell me
question.
your biography afterwards when I'm signing books.
Thank you for that invitation. But watching the great American show, so to say, in Obama's time, and then the sequel in Trump's time, I mean, it was like that. I didn't know this serial was going this way. But in many other places of the world also, we feel that, you know, there's liberal democracy, and then suddenly we feel we are slipping into something else. What do you think are the red flags? Some of the obvious red flags, the suppression of political dissent, we know. But can you think of some other red flags that at the time are not so prominent, but we know that this is a slippery slope by hindsight?
Yeah, this was the subject of my previous book, actually, which is called Twilight of Democracy, and is about democratic decline inside democracies. Autocracy Inc. was a little bit different, but I think the most important thing to look at is rule of law. What happens to judges? What happens to courts? Are lawyers able to act freely? Are laws enforced? Because it's the really deep difference between an autocracy and a democracy, or a free society and a repressed society, is, do you have rule of law, or do you have rule by law, meaning the law is what the person in charge says it is. And so that seems to me the piece of it that's that's very critical. And we had this in Poland over the last several years. We had a previous government that put a lot of pressure on the courts, and fixing it has proved to be very difficult. I mean, once you've damaged a court system or a court tradition, it's very hard to save again. So I think that to me is the key thing.
And so there was a lady in the front row, and then her first, and then behind you.
Thank you very much. Not finished reading your book yet, but you call it Autocracy Inc., that is incorporated. So the question is, this kind of a corporate nexus between the leadership of these countries, like autocratic countries. When you were researching the book, did you see that this is what was going to happen in this particular year with these autocrats? And is it why the other autocrats are not giving a pushback to these kind of erratic action by one autocrat? Is this corporate nexus helping all this, whether Venezuela, Greenland, whatever this is happening, absurdities?
So I did believe that the second Trump term would be very different from the first, and I did write that. Nobody paid attention to me, but I did say it.
I did.
But I did say it. And the reason why is that the events of January the 6th, when Trump assaulted Congress and tried to change the results of the election, meant that all the people who worked for him before, many of whom were Republicans loyal to the Constitution, abandoned him. And instead, the people who were drawn to him were people who themselves disliked the American system or disliked the modern United States or thought it was too multiracial or wanted it to be more Christian or whatever was their dislike of America as it was. They came to work for Trump. And so he has literally attracted the most radical people in the United States to him now, and they're now in the administration. And you could hear this during the campaign. He used language that no American politician, even no American presidential candidate, I'll say that, had used before. So even the segregationists of the past didn't use the openly racist language that Trump used. He talked about immigrants poisoning the blood of the United States. And this expression, poisoning the blood, was first used by Hitler. And whoever wrote that speech for him, I'm sure knew that. I don't think Trump came up with that by himself.
Stephen Miller.
Whoever. So he was using this extremely radical language when he spoke about his enemies, when he spoke about immigrants, when he spoke about the country. He expressed a kind of hatred for the country and for its system. And the fact that he won meant that those people were empowered, and that changed very radically the nature of the government. My impression of certainly the leaders of Russia and China is that they are still not sure yet what to make of this new United States and haven't really formulated policy. But in many ways, of course, what he's doing is an advantage to them, because by further undermining international rule of law, which was always, challenged in the past anyway, by further undermining international institutions, by using this language of big powers and small powers, we get to decide because we're stronger. This is the same language that Putin uses. It's the language that Xi, would use if he ever attacked Taiwan. So Trump is creating this kind of, he's enabling them to behave, as dictatorships, not just at home but abroad.
So there was a lady back in the middle of that row, and then a gentleman with a beard in front afterwards. Sorry, you have a beard, right?
Thank you. You've spoken so powerfully about the way these klepto-autocrats enrich themselves through office. I wonder if these business links also create potential vulnerabilities for them and their regimes. So thinking either of foreign adversaries targeting the businesses to exert pressure, thinking of kind of sanctions on Russian oligarchs, or activists and dissidents within these regimes targeting the businesses as a form of resistance. This is a bit what happened with Musk and Tesla. Do you see those dynamics across some of the different countries you've looked at?
Yeah, so I mean, this was, by the way, the reason that I understand, or that I came to understand the importance of the financial and business dealings of dictators was because I learned it from the Russian opposition. The Russian opposition studied their leadership, and they were the ones who explained just how damaging Western offshore money laundering was, just how damaging crypto was, the way in which these American and European financial institutions were enabling their leadership. And Alexei Navalny's political movement, which was the largest one to oppose Putin, was focused very squarely on corruption. So it wasn't really a democracy movement. It was, but it didn't focus on that language. It focused on corruption, on theft, on the fact that because they steal so much, this is why we have bad roads and bad schools. And that was a very potent slogan inside Russia. And then, of course, we've also had the use of American and European sanctions to target Russian oligarchs as a way of persuading them. So far, those tactics haven't succeeded, in that it turned out that it was possible to kill Navalny and eliminate him. And the Russian oligarchs, although they are under huge pressure, and we know that some of them are very unhappy with the war and unhappy about how it's going, they don't seem to have a mechanism for political change inside Russia. But you're right that it's not a bad way to think, and it's not a bad way to go about putting pressure on these kinds of regimes.
Yeah, the gentleman with the beard there I meant you, but you've also got a beard, so easy mistake to make. No, don't worry, you got the mic. You're next.
Thank you. Good evening. My question is that you said Trumpism. I love that word. How nation like India should tackle the new Trumpism tantrum?
So how should India cope with Trumpism?
I mean, India should. So India is a country that has benefited greatly from being part of the world and connected to the world, and it should go on doing that. India is a country that has also benefited from the language of universal values and rights, and it should go on defending those things. India is a country that has also historically been deeply connected to others. I mean, going back to the non-aligned movement, it's been part of coalitions in the past, and it should continue to do that. I mean, by building coalitions and friendships and relationships, this is how you fight against, a political power that believes in, that might makes right, and only big countries get to decide anything. And so India kind of, by being India, by reaching into your history and finding your best traditions of foreign policy and of democracy, this is the best way to push back over time. I mean, of course, it will be very tempting to respond to Trump, from one day to the next, or bring him some gold bars, or bribe him in some way. But I think over the long term, it will be the deeper strengths of India that will allow you to get through this rocky period of history.
Although we're out of time, I'm going to bend the rules. Yep, and that last question.
Talking about the dictators who run the world, if most of the human history and much of the present countries aren't democratic, does that mean humans are naturally inclined towards flawed but charismatic leaders, or that democracy itself is difficult to sustain?
I think both. Actually, if you look back over history, through most of human history, people have lived in what we would call dictatorships, in monarchies or tribal systems or systems of oligarchy or one-party rule, and it's really the tradition of democracy that's unique and special, and I think that gives people who live now in democracies, who are lucky enough to have lived in this time when we have some free speech and we have free movement and we have the ability to check our rulers and create, and voice our opposition. We should treasure that. We should defend it. We should talk about why it's important. We should explain it to our children who don't remember, a different time, and who aren't aware of the threats and dangers of an autocratic system. I think we started talking about the 1990s. The real mistake made in the 1990s was our assumption that our achievements, that the achievements of the democratic world were forever. That we won the Cold War, we ended, communism, and now it was, democracy was going to continue spreading indefinitely, and that therefore there wasn't anything special we had to do. Democracy was just going to happen. It was like running water, it was available to everybody, and it was just there. And actually, democracies require constant defense and constant reform, and constant thought about what's going wrong and how to fix it, and constant re-explanation and education. And I think the leadership of the democratic world in the beginning of this century forgot that, and I hope people are now remembering it.
That's a perfect note on which to end. So please join me in thanking Anne for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
And thank the sign language. It's real skill to do all that.